Welcome back, everyone, to the front line with Joe and Joe. Joe Pasillo, as always, joined by Joe Rossinello. And once more, dear brothers and sisters, let us go into the breach on the Veritas Catholic Radio Network, 1350 on your AM dial, 103.9 on your FM dial, spreading the truth of the Catholic faith to the New York City metropolitan area. Excuse me. Please be sure to download the app. Share it with your friends. The Veritas app, you'll have access to all of our station's content, not just the front line with Joe and Joe. And if you like what we do, if you like our content, we post these interviews and we also go live Thursday nights, 9 o'clock Eastern time across social media, X, Rumble, Facebook, and YouTube. Wherever you see our ugly mugs, help us out a little bit. Help us get out to a wider audience. Hit a like, subscribe, a share, do all that fun stuff. Joe and I say all the time, obviously, that we're going into the breach, and we take that very, very seriously. Well, today we're going even further into the breach, okay? Because we're going to be discussing with Jeffrey Trissell, who's joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe, his new book, Unlocking the Churches, the Legal Victory Against California's Pandemic-Era Religious Discrimination. And that's available at Sophia Press. As always with Sophia, I will post a link in the description. Go and buy the book, read the book. You'll get a 15% discount because you know Joe and Joe. Now, like I said, I don't want to waste too much time because we want to get into this very, what I would like to call a meaty conversation. Jeffrey Trissell, just for his bio, is a civil litigation attorney in private practice with the law firm of Lemandry and Jana, LLP. He also serves as special counsel to the Thomas More Society, a national not-for-profit public interest law firm dedicated to restoring respect in law for life, family, and religious liberty. The vast majority of his legal practice is devoted to constitutional rights, including First Amendment litigation, political redistricting, defamation, and education rights. Jeffrey Trissell, welcome to the front line with Joe and Joe, our brother.
Thank you.
Now, and like I said, I wasn't kidding when I said we're going into the breach. So everybody out there at Veritas listening to us, buckle up. Joe Rossinello.
Jeff, we always begin with the prayer to Our Lady in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, never was it known that anyone who sought your help or sought your intercession was left unaided. Inspired by this confidence, we fly unto you, a virgin of virgins, our mother. To you we come, for you we stand, sinful and sorrowful. Mother, Word incarnate, despise not our petitions, but in your clemency hear and answer us. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, obviously, this is a touchy subject. To be honest with you, looking back, looking at how COVID was handled by everybody, I thought it was handled poorly, my opinion. Perfect example. I live 12 miles outside of Manhattan. For some reason, the air inside of Lowe's was perfectly fine, packed, yet kids couldn't go to school. How is that justified? You had to wait 2 hours to buy food, yet you can go to Walmart. How is that justified?
How about worse yet? How about you go to Planned Parenthood?
Okay, there it is. Also, let me just put this out there because I don't think a lot of people understand this. It was the largest wealth transfer in the history of America, from elites to regular people. And guess who benefited? The government picked and chose winners and losers. I'll speak for myself. I am what you would call a member of the laptop class. My life wasn't changed at all. In fact, I don't say this openly, but I'm going to say it amongst friends here. My life actually, in many ways, improved. I didn't have to go to work. I saved money. I didn't have to get on the bus. I worked in my basement. So did my wife. We didn't miss a paycheck. I still got paid. What happens if you're a bus driver? What happens if you own a daycare? What happens if you own a restaurant? What happens if you own a gym? You still have a mortgage. The bank still wants its money. What happens to kids who couldn't go to school? Don't tell me every kid in America has their own laptop. Most kids, you have one laptop. Say you have grandma at home who doesn't even speak English, and there's 4 kids, and mom and dad have to work, not so you could have a Mercedes, so you could eat. You think grandma is teaching those kids? You think they all have their own laptop? How many kids got left behind? This was handled horribly, and that's being kind. So this is what we're talking about. Now we're going to focus on the church. Before, I just wanted to get that out there because I can't say enough about this.
I love the rant, Joe. I did.
No, but it's the truth.
I
It's the
did
truth.
love the rant.
before we even get into it, what are your thoughts on just what I said, Jeff? You're in the breach on this. You're a lawyer. I'm not. I do play one on TV though, Jeff, to be honest with you. But tell me your thoughts as a lawyer.
I think your, as Joe said, rant is kind of why I waited 5 years to publish the book, right? Because the emotions about COVID are still so raw, right? Like I wrote the book really, to be honest, a couple years after COVID, and then I realized nobody's going to want to read this. This is like we want to get past COVID. We don't want to even think about it anymore. I mean, it was so horrible in terms of just our national psyche. Um, but now, 5 years out, where we're getting to the 5 year anniversary of a lot of these things that happen in the book, I do think it's timely, and we can start thinking about what happened and what and trying to be as objective as we can regarding the mistakes that were made, but also the um, understanding that the failings that were made were not always malicious. Sometimes they were, sometimes they were just incredibly stupid, incredibly, uh, in law, we have terms like negligence and gross negligence. Negligence generally means you you made a mistake, right? Gross negligence means you made a mistake that was so big that you we can't think of it as a mistake anymore. It should be treated more like an intentional wrongdoing because your mistake was so bad. Um, and yeah, that during the pandemic, it was a lot of decisions seemed much more like gross negligence to me. And then when we got the pushback, the severe pushback against politicians, things started to turn towards, intentional malice, intentional wrongdoing, and it seemed to my part.
No, and I think that's exactly right. Jeffrey Trissell's joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe. Please go out and buy his book, Unlocking the Churches, The Legal Victory Against California's Pandemic Era Religious Discrimination. We'll get into the specifics. I want to know, and our audience, Jeffrey, wants to know about what that legal victory was. But I'm with you on that. Again, Joe and I are faithful Catholics. One thing we do not do on this show, we don't beat up on the bishops. I know, we're respectfully critical, okay, and I think that's completely legitimate, all right. And I'll be honest with you. I tried. Joe actually had to calm me down a little bit doing the show because my knee jerk reaction was don't to the bishops in my mind and in my heart was don't listen to Governor Murphy, don't listen to Andrew Cuomo, don't listen. You're the Roman Catholic Church. Just say no. If Planned Parenthood's open, if Lowe's is open, if the effing bowling alley's open, okay, well then the church is going to be open. And so but again, I tried to understand there's a lot of considerations. People we would love to sue the church. Somebody gets sick, and all of a sudden they're going to file a lawsuit.
Mhm.
So I understand those practical considerations. I just felt though I'll give you the perfect example, and then I'll throw it over to you. So I'm watching. I think it was Tucker Carlson. This was a few years ago, obviously during this time. All right, and he's got on Governor Murphy from New Jersey. All right, and you're talking about obviously constitutional rights. That's your area of expertise. Okay, and Tucker's asking me, he says, "What about the Bill of Rights? What about the right to assembly? What about?" He goes, "Well, I didn't even take that into consideration." Tucker rightfully says, "See, what about the churches?" He goes, "I called Cardinal Tobin. He said no problem." And I'm bringing this up only because I said to myself as I'm watching that, that's right. That's right. The church did not push back, not to any degree that would have satisfied me. And that's where I felt like they were negligent. Because Joe and I were receiving communion in a parking lot in ShopRite in Lyndhurst, New Jersey, with an 85-year-old priest who would drive his truck there to give everybody confession in the Holy Eucharist. Okay. It
Mhm.
shouldn't be that way. I think you know where I'm going with that. I just felt that, and I want your opinion. I just felt like the bishops could have fought back. Again, I'm not speaking of all of them, but the bishops in general could have fought back a lot more. And I quite frankly was let down. What are your thoughts on that?
My first thought really is the to go back to my book, right? So it recounts all of the COVID litigation on behalf of churches for the entire pandemic, and it starts with cases that I was not involved with at all, that I had to research and find because I was fascinated by. And those were cases filed like March 17th, March 19th, right? Right when we were locking down. And I think at the very beginning, everybody viewed those cases as kind of um, silly, right? Like it was, and so, when if at the initial lockdown, I actually think it's commendable that a politician called the cardinal and said, "Hey, we want you guys on board because the church is important." Um, and so I did not file my lawsuits on behalf of churches until about 6 weeks into the pandemic, early May, which I think a lot of people still view it as too early. Um, but at that point, I think it's one thing for the bishops to say, we're going to follow our government leaders, and we're glad that we're part of the conversation during the original lockdown. But then the reopening was bungled horribly, where they um, in California especially. I mean, basically in late April they said we're going to start reopening sectors, and restaurants could reopen, but not churches. All the sectors that could reopen that were deemed less than essential were allowed to reopen, but not churches, because I guess we're even less than essential.
But doesn't that tell you, Joe? I'm sorry, I want to stay there. But doesn't that tell you that you mentioned malice earlier? Okay,
Mhm.
on the part of, let's say, for argument's sake, politicians, we could rattle them off the top of our heads. Okay, because we were all wondering why they're getting away with what they're getting away with. All right, yes, it seemed very malicious. That again, I could. They're trying to tell me I'm not supposed to believe my lying eyes. I see all the things that you're allowing to be opened. Okay, but then
Liquor
for some
stores,
reason, I'm. What's that?
liquor stores.
Well, then listen, Patrick mentioned, excuse me, Jeffrey mentioned March 18th. Okay. I always said in my mind, the day after St. Patty's Day, they'd let everybody go out and get drunk the night before so they wouldn't realize the next day that they're on lockdown. Okay. I'm just joking a little bit. My point is, I felt like it was malicious. And that's why we were so overjoyed that you were coming on the show to discuss your book. For those of you just joining us, Unlocking the Churches, the Legal Victory Against California's Pandemic Era Religious Discrimination. It's available at Sophia Press. Okay. Um, so let me go here. Let's get right back to the book real quick. So what specifically for our audience, what was the main legal victory in California that your book discusses?
I think there are two halves to it. So uh, we represented South Bay Pentecostal Church in San Diego, and we actually had the very first case to go to the U.S. Supreme Court. And in late May, we got a 5-4 loss. And that was very devastating and kind of opened the floodgates across the country for the next 6 months, giving politicians carte blanche to do whatever they wanted, discriminate against churches. But thankfully, we were able to have that reversed in a 6-3 victory in early 2021. So the victory was essentially an order to Governor Newsom that he could not keep the churches closed in California. The second victory, really, is that during that 6 month period when governors had carte blanche, we started seeing the government coming after churches that were ignoring its orders, right? So all throughout the summer in California, churches were not allowed to open. They had to hold worship services in their parking lots, if at all. And many churches said, no, we're just going to open. Um, and so there were prosecutions. And we defended Grace Community Church and Pastor John MacArthur, who just passed away, uh, who was being aggressively pursued by the County of Los Angeles, and thankfully defeated the prosecution. And the way we defeated the prosecution was by delaying until we got the Supreme Court victory. Um, but overall, it was we were very happy to prevent him from being held in contempt of court or, arrested.
I'm going to be very pointed. Any Catholic bishops, did they join you in that fight? File paper. You mentioned the Grace Episcopal Church. You mentioned John, who recently passed, Pastor John. Anybody in the Catholic world come to you and say, I want to file? Yes or no?
We did not have a Catholic bishop in any
That
of our
is
cases.
pathetic. I will say that publicly. That is pathetic. Pathetic. And we have the fullness of truth. We have the Eucharist, we have the Blessed Sacrament, we have confession, we have the fullness of truth. That is pathetic. And I will go on, I'll say it publicly. How a Protestant church who doesn't even have the funds that the Catholic Church has did not go to the mats and basically say, and listen, I get I live in the world and I understand that we just went through litigation and in many cases due to the sex crisis, um, Catholic churches went bankrupt. I get all that. However, I don't think in the history of the Catholic Church, the churches were ever closed. Like ever. Now, granted, we're
Mhm.
going through a different period. There is, a litigious situation. People do fight. People take, file frivolous lawsuits. I get that. But how about go to parking lots? Have masses in parking lots, do stuff, workarounds. I didn't even see that in New Jersey. And to Joe's point, the priest that did serve mass was 80 years old. So he actually, there was a threat of him dying. By the way, he was a doctor who left his practice to become a priest. So he actually had some insight into diseases and into medicine. And he still did his job in a parking lot. I went to confession. My family didn't miss mass. I think it was a sad, sad, sad display. And you did have some cardinals like Cardinal Dolan admitting that after the fact. Okay, great. I take it. But good Lord, when you mention some of these pastors, there's also a famous pastor, I can't recall his name, in Moscow, Idaho. He's another one who went to the mattress. He was just like, no, I'm not doing it. How does no sound? We're the Catholic Church. Like in plain English, it was, I'll be honest with you, Jeff, it's just disappointing. I want to bring that out and call a spade a spade. It's just, it was very, very disappointing.
So I think there are two halves to that from my perspective. The first half is that um, there were bishops across the country that stood up, right? And I think that's commendable, um, just not in California. And I think in California, we lobbied hard trying to get the Catholic Church to join our lawsuit and or one of our lawsuits, and we were unsuccessful. We also knew a lot of Eastern Catholic churches in California, but they didn't want to get crossways with the California Catholic Conference. And then so our only Catholic client was an SSPX priest, but we got the very first injunction in America on behalf of him, or in California on behalf of him. Um, and in retrospect, I think it might not have been the wisest thing for the Catholic bishops to join our lawsuit in the sense that it was a very hard uphill legal fight. And so, if they didn't feel like they were going to actually achieve anything, why would you join a lawsuit?
Right.
On the other hand, Pastor John MacArthur didn't want to join a lawsuit either. He just opened and then was sued. And I think that's what we were missing in California, where, the I think you could make a very reasoned judgment that a Catholic bishop joining a lawsuit is not going to get a legal victory. But it's not about a legal victory. It's about opening your church. That's what's actually important. And being willing to go to prison because you opened your church. And Pastor John MacArthur was, and none of the bishops were.
No, I understand. Jeffrey Chishol's joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe, unlocking the church as the legal victory against California's pandemic era religious discrimination. Now, I'm just a dumb Italian from New Jersey, Jeffrey. So this might seem like an obvious question, okay, but I'm going to ask: Is it because was the legal reasoning of the Supreme Court in the 5-4 decision? Is that the government does have the right to curtail your constitutional rights in the case of a national emergency? And as judges, I mean, again, I'm not the lawyer, but I would have, and I'm sure the attorneys did present the argument that it doesn't seem like this lockdown is being applied equally across the board, as we alluded to earlier. All right, I can't for the life of me understand how they would have possibly lost. My point is that in a national emergency, does the government have the right to do what it did, and even in an uneven way? You know where I'm going with that?
So our initial loss, 5-4, was on an emergency application. So there are a lot of um, unique procedures in the law depending on unique circumstances. And normally, when the Supreme Court rules on an emergency application, um, you don't get an opinion. you get a one sentence saying denied. And here, that was the majority opinion. The five justices that joined the majority, their opinion was denied. Chief Justice Roberts wrote a concurring opinion explaining why he joined with the liberal bloc in voting against us. And that one justice concurring opinion has no precedential value. It's technically irrelevant. Um, but it ended up becoming his most important judicial opinion, I think, in his whole career. It was cited 300 times in the next 6 months. Um, and his reasoning is not particularly clear, but it does seem to lean into the concept of like fog of war and national emergency, and we don't want to second guess the government during a crisis of this magnitude. Which another topic I talk about in the book is this constant buckling we have. So the jurisprudence is very clear that the Bill of Rights is most important during crises. So it's the Bill of Rights was written for World War II, for the Civil War, for the pandemic, but that's when it's least applied, right? Um, and so it's supposed to be strongest during those times, and yet it never is. We buckle, and then afterwards we write opinions saying, "Oh, well, we shouldn't have," right? And then the next crisis that comes up, we buckle again. Um, so on the one hand, I think the Supreme Court followed a venerable tradition of buckling and not wanting to stand up during a crisis. But that's obviously not how the framers intended when they wrote the Bill of Rights, and really not. It's just another one of the examples of, wow, we really shouldn't have done that.
Well, you know what it is, Jeffrey, and then I'm going to hand it over to Joe before the break. We have time for another question. It's like all the people that are always carping about, threat to democracy, threat to democracy. It's as you just said. It's easy when everything's going just great to say, "Hey, we respect constitutional rights." It's in the time of crisis, in the time of war. Okay, we mentioned the Civil War and World War One and World War Two and COVID. That's when you really have to buckle down. That's when you really have to say, no, our rights are our rights. The church, we keep this with the church because your book is about unlocking the churches. In other words, the church, in my opinion, they said, we got this. We understand there's a health problem going on. We understand what's going on with COVID. We got this. We'll organize. We'll do the things that we're supposed to, but you're not shutting us down. We're not going to celebrate mass because you, Governor Murphy. I pick on Governor Murphy because even though I'm in Arizona now, I've only been here 3 years. I'm a Jersey boy. Okay, I pick on Governor Murphy because he's the poster child for all of this and others. Is that to me? It's like no. Do you understand the threat to democracy is when you do have these crises that will arise. Okay, at any given time. That's when you really have to find strength in the Constitution. Not supposed to water it down and say, eh, we won't worry about that right now. Joe, we have 5 minutes before the break. Where do you want to go with Jeffrey?
Just a comment, and I'm not saying that there was malice because I don't know the hearts of people who made decisions. But Rahm Emanuel famously said, he was the chief of staff for Barack Obama, never let a crisis go to waste. And sadly, that is how politics operate. I'm not saying that this was a decision made in that manner, but I am saying that that is how politics operate. Case in point, our voting changed as a result of COVID. It went from 30% mail-in ballots to 70% mail-in ballots, and noticed it never changed back. There have been studies where that have said very clearly that that is a way to vote which is more open to fraud than if you vote in person. The country of France recently backed away from that. So I'm not just talking out of my head. I'm not talking as if I'm a Trumper. I'm telling you facts. It never changed as a result of a crisis. By the way, judges, no, not judges, judges and secretaries of state made that decision. It was not made by legislatures, as in the people had no say in it. That went to the Supreme Court too. Clarence Thomas wrote an opinion on it, and he said it was dangerous. And that's still going on as we speak. So people should be aware of that as well. As you could tell, Jeff, I'm insane as a result of this. Truly. And
Well,
I'm going to.
you started out insane. You just
Well, I can't
insaner.
help it. And I'm going to be honest with you too, Jeff. Because of what I have witnessed in the last 10 years, I don't really have faith in our institutions anymore. I'm being completely truthful with you. I don't. I'll say that publicly. I wish I did. I have just seen too much. I can't unsee what I saw. And I am sure I am not the same. I'm not alone in that. Your thoughts on that? Because to be truthful with you, it's troubling. Troubling.
My first thought is to think about the Catholic Church. So I came of age during the reign of Pope Benedict, and he was, in my mind, amazing in every way, right? He had a very similar temperament to myself. I loved his theology. And then when Pope Francis came on board, it was like, okay, we don't have that much in common, a very, very different temperament. And I felt a little bit homeless for a while, especially because here in San Diego, it's I'm not from San Diego originally, and the church here is very, very different from where I grew up. And then during the pandemic, we lost faith in all of our government institutions as well, and it was a little bit of a feeling very, very homeless. But I think that's I keep thinking of this. It seems like we have a new dawn with the election of Trump, with Pope Leo, who, I immediately started reading the encyclicals of Pope Leo the 13th because he said that he was inspired by Pope Leo the 13th. And I'm like, wow, I really like this thought. And so I, my personal view is that the pandemic was probably good for I think it might have been good for our soul as a nation. There are certain things that in my practice, right, I deal a lot with abortion, deal a lot with transgender issues, and a lot of those issues feel much more like demonic, and the devil is just playing and having fun because it's so messed up. Whereas the closure of the churches felt much more like a chastisement that God might have allowed the devil to impose on us. And that chastisement hopefully woke us up and is leading to well, hopefully it led to the election of Trump. I mean, I've always been a pretty big fan of Trump, and I've been excited with this most recent 6 months. Um,
Well,
so that's
at the very least, I feel I'm sorry, and we're not, Joe and I have said a million times on this show. Jeffrey Trissell's joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe. I voted for Trump 3 times, okay, and I could be disappointed or deflated at times with certain things that happen. But here's one thing I know: the other side has shown themselves to be not only insane, but you use the word demonic. When you support the things that they support, what other conclusion can you come to say, okay, I might agree with Trump on 6 things, 7 things out of 10. Okay, not everything, or and I feel let down sometimes. All right, but here's the bottom line: I can't possibly vote for evil. I can't, and yes, we could demonstrate with a list as long as our collective arms, the evil things that are being promoted. One of which, yeah, was the lockdowns. Okay, because in my view, it was nothing short of malice. It was deliberate. They wanted to lock down the churches, but as you said, all right, the law of unintended consequences. They thought that they were doing something that was going to give them more power, but I think there is a Joe and I say all the time on the show, Jeffrey, there is in our view, a revival, if you will, in America because we were deprived of being able to worship our God. And now and we can't take it for granted because these people they'll take it away from you like that, and that's why you're on the show to discuss this because they did it during COVID. If you're just joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe, we're going to take a quick break. We have Jeffrey Trissell here with us, Unlocking the Churches, the legal victory against California's pandemic era religious discrimination. That's available at Sophia Press. If you buy it from the publisher using the link I'll post in the description, you'll get a 15% discount because you know Joe and Joe. So, like I said, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to come right back at the Veritas Catholic Radio Network. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back, everyone, to the front line with Joe and Joe. Joe Pasillo and Joe Rossinello. We are way in the breach with Jeffrey Trissell. We're discussing his new book, Unlocking the Churches, the Legal Victory Against California's Pandemic Era Religious Discrimination. It's available at Sophia Press. Click the link in the description. It'll take you right to the website. Look for the book, and you'll get a 15% discount because you know Joe and Joe. Joe, I'm going to throw it right over to you.
Let's talk about the Constitution for a minute, because clearly, religious liberty is a fundamental right. It was part of the Constitution from the very beginning. The framers, it was important to them. They came from a country whereby there was a state religion and it was imposed on people. So they came to this country from the very beginning to have freedom of religion. Now, that has been twisted. The separation of church and state is not understood by the masses in America, and it's been twisted. But here is a reality. You mentioned something about the cases that you dealt with, and there was like basically an understanding of what is essential. That was an underlying like benchmark that's being looked at. Now, let's be fair and honest. Our country is not exactly um, the most religious country. Let's be truthful. I say this on the show, and I'm going to be very blunt. I think our Christianity in America is a mile wide and an inch deep. We kill children up until birth in America. That's illegal. How could you call yourself a Christian country? We allow minors to get mutilated in states without parental insight or direction. How could you call yourself a Christian nation and allow that? Like, in my opinion, if you're for that, you're disqualified. Like, in a healthy society, it's not even like you're disqualified. Just like, Jeff, if you said to me, we're going to kill everyone over the age of 75 that can't work, I'd be like, Jeff, you're disqualified. You can't run. You're not a healthy person. So we're not a
Mhm.
Christian nation. Let's be honest. So, and this is getting back to what you said, Jeff. You basically said, is it an essential? Now, coming from a secular humanist perspective, like Gavin Newsom, he's not exactly, arguing that Holy Communion should be received on his knees and not in the hand. He's not of that camp. So, Gavin Newsom, from his secular humanist perspective, could be like, this isn't an essential. Like, I'm trying to weigh risk here. I'm looking at it in a sober manner as a bureaucrat. It isn't essential. My people who vote for me, this isn't important to them. And those crazy people who basically it is important to them, not only aren't they going to vote for me, but they're a small minority. So as far as what I'm ticking my box, as far as what's essential, it's not essential. What are your thoughts on that and that basic, summary?
I really liked your comment that religion in America is a mile wide but an inch deep. Because one of the more fascinating things I find in current jurisprudence at the U.S. Supreme Court level is um, there are a lot of different legal theories as to how you can interpret the Constitution, whose text is not always the most detailed or clear, right? So, uh, one of the liberal leaning views was that it's, a living constitution that needs to be constantly updated to be applied to modern circumstances. Um, 20 years ago, we had kind of a an originalist resurgence under Justice Scalia, where we were talking about the original meaning of the text as it applied in 1789. And that view has become very, very prominent in conservative legal thinking, and now is coming to dominate the court. So we have like the obvious example is, for the Second Amendment, right? They say, you had a musket in 1789, so we need to use analogical reasoning to say what restrictions on guns would be analogous to restrictions on a musket in 1789. And so we have this very, very historical originalist perspective that's now emerging on the court, but it's very hard to apply that to the free exercise of religion, right? Because in the past 100 years, religion in America has become so varied, right? Like, and so there is no definition of religion in the law that's really concrete. There's, for tax purposes, right? We can say that a church, because churches have um, different rules under the tax code than even nonprofits, right? They're less regulated. And so a lot of religious organizations want to be considered a church. And you're like, well, do you have a congregation that meets every week? Well, no, that's not part of my faith. Okay. Well, and we constantly have to water down to fit in everybody who wants to say, this is my religion. And I think even in the Ninth Circuit in California, the definition of religion in some of the cases is harkens back to St. Augustine, where basically we all have a hole in our heart that's God-shaped, and you can fill that with God or with anything, and whatever you fill it with is your religion. So, it could be, essentially exercising, health every Sunday. Uh, and so when we don't have a really good understanding of what religion is, then how do you decide which aspects of religion are essential, right? Is practicing yoga on the beach essential? Well, frankly, I don't think it is. So I would agree with Governor Newsom in saying you can't do that. But in terms of, I think we just need to return to like clarity and obviousness, right? Attending church on Sunday as part of the Catholic faith is essential. Anything other than that, then you get into, well, our Protestant brethren, or what about you know, the the interesting, Jewish requirement, right? You have to have 10 people, 10 adult males to have a quorum to have a Jewish service. And I guess, yeah, in my mind, the problem is that we don't even know what religion is in America. And so it was very easy for people to say, well, it's not essential because there's so much stuff that counts as religion. And I I'm leaning more towards, even if we as a Christian nation, even if we don't extend uh all the best favors to people of faith in the next crisis, we got to go back to our origin and be like, we are a Christian nation, so we can't close the churches.
Well, the problem is Jeffrey Chishol's joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe. In my mind, people are just so afraid. I can't understand why. I think people fear so much, as Joe likes to say on the show all the time, because if they talk that way, they're not going to get invited to the barbecue, or they're not going to get invited to the cocktail party because people don't like what you're saying. My attitude and Joe's attitude is good. I'll find other like-minded people and I'll befriend them, and we'll have our own barbecue. I don't need you, and I don't care what you think of me. And people are afraid to do that. People are afraid to say, no, this is a Christian nation, okay? That it's founded on Christian principles, okay? That's why we have a Bill of Rights. I wish people would go back and study a little bit. But where I want to go, Jeffrey Trissell, for those of you just joining us, is with us at the front line with Joe and Joe. Please go out and buy his book, read his book, Unlocking the Churches, the Legal Victory Against California's Pandemic Era Religious Discrimination. But, Jeffrey, if you don't mind, let's I want to try to convey something to our audience and anybody listening to the front line with Joe and Joe about the way the left uses it is just makes me want to throw up, to be honest with you. This idea, they say, well, there's a wall between church and state. Okay, okay, we get that. Sounds great. Okay, but I want to tell you my take on it, what I think is correct, the correct assessment of that, and I want to throw it over to you. To see if you agree. Thomas Jefferson, now correct me if anything I'm wrong factually. Thomas Jefferson wrote that letter. That phrase appeared in a letter to the Danbury Baptists, okay? And in that letter, he said there was a wall of separation between church and state. I might not be getting it exact, but you know where I'm going, okay? It's not to protect the state from religion. It's to protect religion from the state. That's what he was assuring them of in that letter. The left uses it to say, no, 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 that's to protect the state. No, 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 no. That's to protect. This is why we're even having this conversation. Is because the state has shown time and time and time and time again that the state can encroach on religious liberty. Going back to, if you want to start with the Scopes trial, okay, or in the 50s when they took prayer out of the schools. Where am I wrong, Jeffrey?
I think that's exactly correct. Frankly, that yeah, the purpose of that is to limit the the state, not limit the church. And so, like, I kind of agree with the concept, right? Like, the easy conservative response is, well, the wall of separation isn't in the Constitution; it's in a letter from one, signer of the Constitution. He wasn't, or he was obviously not the even the prime author of the Constitution, right? So, but I think also there's, what do we mean by church, right? Like, church and religion are not synonymous. Religion is reality, right? Secular humanism is not reality. And so you can't just push reality out of the public sphere, and so, yeah, like religion in schools, religious monuments that recognize the reality of God, the reality of Christianity, um, that should not be pushed out of the public sphere. And then, yeah, like the whole point of the separation is to say that the you can't close the churches, right? So when they say that, um, we're just going to issue a blanket order banning gatherings of more than 50 people, okay, but it can't apply to churches because of the wall of separation. And then I also think that the word state, what does that mean, right? Like, as the governments have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger in the past 200 years, you know, I guess people kind of think of state as everything. The government shouldn't be everything, right? Obviously, the government should be limited. And the reason this we have a wall of separation is because the government does have a lot of power, even if it's relatively small or limited, and it can't wield that power against churches, right? Like, um, I think that's, yeah, the best interpretation of that. Um, Especially because in 1789, when the Constitution was ratified, there were state churches, right? State-sponsored churches. Maryland
Yeah.
was a Catholic um, state. And so the whole point was the federal government can't pick and choose winners and losers because that needs to be left to the people in their states. Um,
Am I wrong, Jeffrey? Am I wrong if I turn around and said if a state wanted to have a Catholic cardinal as their governor, okay, and run their state as a Catholic state, theoretically, under our Constitution, there should be no problem with that. Am I wrong about that? Maybe not the cardinal being the governor part. Okay, maybe leaving that aside for a second. But if I'm in Arizona, if Arizona had a preponderance of Catholics, let's say 80% Catholics, said we're going to be a Catholic state. We're going to rework the Constitution of the state of Arizona, and we're going to apply Catholic social teaching to the Catholic Church, and that's going to infuse and inform all of our laws that we pass. Uh, Now I know we fought a civil war over this. Don't get me wrong, but theoretically, as you mentioned about Maryland, is Arizona not allowed to do that?
my my book really has three parts to it, and one part is relatively dense legalese trying to explain the American legal system and the history of the development of the Constitution in the context of religion so that a layperson can follow the religious arguments. So this would fit into that in terms of, obviously, there's the original meaning of the Constitution in 1789, and then we had the second founding, right, after the Civil War, where we passed the Reconstruction amendments that really um, reinterpreted the text of the Constitution. So the First Amendment, right, it literally says Congress shall not make any law with respect to an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, right? So is Congress is limited by the Bill of Rights, by the First Amendment. But because of states wanting to hold on to slavery, the Reconstruction Amendments um, severely increased the power of the federal government under the Constitution and limited the powers of states. And as a result of that, we interpret the Bill of Rights now as also limiting the state governments. So the First Amendment still says Congress shall not make any law established with respect to an establishment of religion. But we've interpreted the 14th Amendment as saying that all governments, not just Congress, shall not do so.
Mm-hmm.
So no, we cannot do that anymore. Um,
Right, but and I think that's one of the
and I
again,
think
it's the
it's a valid
fault.
interpretation of the 14th Amendment. The
Right,
purpose of it. I mean, it's not like a living constitution thing where they just make stuff up, right? Like, like the abortion, right? Like that's not, there's nothing from which you can interpret abortion, right? That was just made up. This interpretation of the power of the 14th Amendment, I think, was the correct interpretation of how it was meant to uh, completely change the entire Constitution.
All right. Thank you for that. Jeffrey Trissell's joining us here at the front line with Joe and Joe. Joe Pasillo, Joe Rossinello, we are definitely in the breach. I feel like I'm following Henry V storming the castle, unlocking the churches, the legal victory against California's pandemic era religious discrimination. It's available at Sophia Press. Please click the link in the description. You'll get a discount because you know Joe and Joe. Joe Rossinello.
Let's talk a little bit about the legal and moral recourse that the faithful has in the face of an unjust law. Now, obviously, laws, historically speaking, have been unjust. Slavery, that's unjust. That was legal. Legal was unjust. We could swing it to something recent in the news. The cake guy in Colorado. I'm using official terms here, Jeff. He's the
The
cake
cake
guy.
guy. Yeah.
He went to the mat. He was just like, I'm not doing it. I'm a Christian. I'm not making your cake. I have no issue with you as people, but you're getting married. I don't recognize that marriage. So therefore, I'm not going to make that. I'm not making that cake. And he went to the mat. Let's talk as a Catholic. I work in corporate America. You absolutely cannot publicly say that I do not believe in same sex marriage. There is a very good chance right now in America, if you work for a Fortune 500 company, if you publicly say that, even if you put it in the terms of, listen, I'm Jewish, we don't acknowledge that. I have no issue with you as a person, but I view marriage between a man and a woman. There is a strong chance that you will be sacked in America right now. Now, is that constitutional? Shouldn't be. The way I see it, I'm not a lawyer. I do play one on TV, Jeff. Um, I don't think that is, but that's reality. This is where I'm going with it. Sometimes you got to take it on the chin in life. You just got to take it on the chin. And we're not willing to do that. Sometimes you just have to say, well, listen, I can't take that job because ultimately that's the reality. And I'm not going to compromise myself because I live for an audience of one, and it's God. I don't care what your law says. How does that sound? I look at marriage between a man and a woman. I don't care if every Supreme Court justice from now until kingdom come says so. Tough. I don't acknowledge that. And I'm not going to not say it. I'll say it nicely, but I look at marriage between a man and a woman. And if that means that I can't have a certain job, so be it. We're not willing to do that. And that goes for the guy in the back of the church to the guy in front of it. And that's what this said to me. We should have just been like, after a point, tough. How does tough sound? Let me spell it for you. Tough. And if that means I get fined, if that means Martin Luther King did that, he went to jail. He went to jail. St. Paul, that's why he has ST in front of his name. They beat him senseless. We're not willing to do that. And that's why I say our Christianity in America is a mile wide and an inch deep. Your thoughts on the moral and legal recourse to just say to something that's unjust, no, civil disobedience. I'm going to the mat. We interviewed another aside, a guy in Canada, another Protestant for the record. He went to jail. He was a pastor in Canada during the lockdown. We interviewed him on our social media show. Where's the Catholics? Where are we? Your
Mhm.
thoughts, Jeff?
Well, my first thought is I want to refer to the cake lady in Bakersfield, California,
Love
who
it.
I've been defending since 2017. We got her the first victory in America on this issue, but we were just reversed by the California Court of Appeal. So we'll be petitioning the U.S. Supreme Court shortly. Um, so shout out to Kathy Miller. Um, Secondly, Yeah, I think as Catholics, we have a moral duty to, I guess, develop a screw you fund, right? In the sense that when I first started out as a lawyer, I had, obviously a significant amount of debt. And I was super excited when I finally got to a positive net worth. And then when I could save some money and could be like, hey, if I got fired tomorrow, we'll be okay. But then, of course, when you have a family, your debts start increasing. You got a mortgage, you got think about your kids' financial future, your educational future, et cetera, et cetera. And so I started having to change my thinking and be like, well, okay, I mean, obviously, if I got fired, we would not be homeless tomorrow, but it would not be good for my family, right? Like they would have to deal with a significant burden. And then I started thinking about the life of St. Thomas More, right? So St. Thomas More, for those who don't know, is the patron saint of lawyers. He was the Lord Chancellor of England, which is essentially the equivalent of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and the Prime Minister. And he basically said, I'm not going to accept the king's break with Rome. I'm not going to accept his new wife. I'm not going to accept him as the king, the head of the church. And he was imprisoned. And I think analogously, like with the pandemic, when he was first imprisoned, he was pretty nice. He could have as many books as he wanted, and he just sat there all day reading. And he had, at that point, you had to pay for your own food. So he had enough money to have his servants bring him food. Um, Eventually, they decided he was enjoying himself too much, and so they took away his books and et cetera, et cetera. But the pushback he got mostly was from his family, from his wife, from his daughters, basically saying, you're sacrificing us for this. Please don't. Please don't. Please take the oath. We liked our life. Um, and he had to say, well, sorry, no. No. Yes, I'm the head of this family and I'm leading us in this direction. And I'm, I'm sorry but I'm going to ignore your pleas. I'm going to say no to your pleas and I'm going to say no. And so I think that would probably be the hardest thing for me personally. And I think probably for most fathers is just, you know, well, I would put my family through all this. And the answer is yes, you would. You have to. I mean, that your duty is to God first. And
Right.
your duty to your children requires showing them that their duty is to God first.
Yeah, I mean, and again, it's obviously a very, very difficult thing, but our enemies know that too. In other words, they know that they love to put you in positions like that. Not That's why, again, like Joe said, that's why Thomas More has the ST in front of his name, because God comes first. Uh, Jeffrey, we have a couple minutes left. Here's where I want to go. Um, it's obviously what we're going through out there right now. A lot of people call the culture war. I think we as Catholics know that that's an appropriate term. The more accurate term is spiritual battle. This is a spiritual battle. I wish people would understand that. If they understood that, then they might think of the fight a little bit differently. You want to protect your wife and kids, you have to protect their souls first and foremost. Okay, that our job is to get our wives and our children to heaven. Now, where I want to go is this: where do you see this culture war slash spiritual battle? Where do you see the state of the battle right now? To deny that there is one, obviously, I think is
Mhm.
crazy. I don't think any reasonable person has to understand this is a war. That's why one of the reasons why you probably wrote your book. You understand that going after the church is central in this battle, in this war. Where do you see the state of affairs right now? Where do you see it going? I happen to think that we're seeing a bit of a resurgence, and I think COVID's part of that. Okay, what are your thoughts on that? We have a couple minutes left.
I was really excited when Pope Leo the 14th chose his name because I've always been a fan of Pope Leo the 13th and the Saint Michael prayer and his vision that the devil would have the 20th century to do what he will. And so I thought, now that we're in the 21st century, hopefully things will turn around. And then we had gay marriage and transgenderism and chemical abortion, and it felt like maybe we need to be counting the centuries from 33 AD or whenever the crucifixion was. So maybe that the 21st century doesn't really start until 2030, 2133, 2033, or I don't know. But it didn't feel like things were going that great. And so at that, especially in the past several years, I've been fascinated by the apocalyptic books, right? Like uh, Benson's The Lord of the World, right, which is a book written by a priest about um, the end of the world and the second coming of Christ, and how essentially it comes down to the very, very end when the last um, at the end of the church, and they're being persecuted across the world. At the very, very end, when the church is being destroyed, that's when the second coming has. And I guess in my mind, it was like, okay, like we don't necessarily need to win, right? Um, when the church was being destroyed in the end of that book, they were just praying, being good, holy people, following God, and knowing that the second coming would happen and that everything would be okay. Um, and that's how I kind of viewed things for a while under the Supreme Court before the Trump court, really, was that, you just got to fight and do your best, and you're going to lose a lot of these cases, these religious liberty cases. And it's going to be very hard for you emotionally and spiritually because these are very important things to win, but they're very, very hard to win. Um, but with the Trump court, uh, with Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and Barrett, and primarily Alito and Thomas, there's a new dawn. I mean, there is wins to be had if you push hard. And the Supreme Court hasn't been allowing us to push as hard as we want. They want wanting to walk slowly, but we've been getting some really amazing legal victories in the past couple of years that I think are going to reshape the country, right? The reintroducing religion into the public sphere, right? Because the separation of church and state, we interpret it as we need to push religion completely out of this public sphere, which is legally and morally wrong. And now we're bringing it back, which just makes me super excited about what's going to
No,
happen next.
absolutely. Jeffrey, I'm sorry. We're coming up on the end, but that's why, again, we'd love to have you back. This was a great conversation. I know our audience is really going to enjoy it. That's why, we have to point out to people the ACLU, the SPLC, all of these groups, they're hard Marxists, is what they are. They have nothing more in mind, amongst other things, than the destruction of the church. The church is always the target of the revolutionaries, okay? And the truth is always the target of the revolutionaries. That's why what you're doing, what the St. Thomas More Society is doing, what your law firm, Lemandry and John, are doing, that's why it's so important that we support you. Jeffrey, where can people support Thomas More and Lemandry and John?
ThomasMoreSociety.org. That's one O in more. You can read about all of our cases. We do abortion, marriage, transgender issues, and obviously churches. And then Lemandry.com is Limandri.com. And we do business litigation, real estate litigation, personal injury litigation. Really, we're a general civil litigation boutique.
Awesome. Jeffrey, like I said, this was a great conversation. You're welcome back here on the show anytime, brother.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And you remember, everybody out there, going by the book, Unlocking the Churches, The Legal Victory Against California's Pandemic Era Religious Discrimination. Click the link in the description. It'll take you right to Sophia's website. You could get the book with a 15% discount. Remember to share all of our conversations, whether it's on the Veritas app or on social media. Help us get out to a wider audience, particularly conversations like this one. So thank you once again. And remember, until the next time, that our conversation is your conversation, and that conversation is going on everywhere. We'll talk to you soon.